Hi, good morning, everyone. I am very, very excited about today's Let's Talk COVID-19 talk. It is the last of this current series that we are doing, and I know it's going to be one that is on everybody's mind today. I cannot get over listening to the news this morning and the news being inundated with COVID-19 information. And it's sometimes hard. It's sometimes hard to think of what could be real, what is not real. Is the source I'm listening to correct? Am I digesting something that maybe isn't very correct? But that's what we're getting into today. We're talking about the misinformation, disinformation, and this impending not pandemic, but infodemic. And there's a new word for today. So we're going to talk a little bit about this infodemic that's going on in our world, especially when we look at our digital world and our digital platforms. So we're going to look at, how is misinformation spread, especially when we look at COVID-19. We're going to look at how do we identify it. And when we look at our social circles, what is the information that we're receiving? How do we believe certain things? And we're just going to get into all of this information today. This is a joint presentation between Science North and Laurentian University. My name is Amy Henson. I am a Blue Coat and staff scientist at Science North, and I'm happy to be your host today. But we want to make sure that we bring Laurentian on as well. They have been an amazing partner. So I'm going to introduce to you today Dr. Dean Miller. Dean Miller is the Interim Dean of Science, Engineering, and Architecture at Laurentian University, and he will say a few words on behalf of Laurentian University. Welcome, Dean.
Good morning. Bienvenue, Annie Keke Wache. On behalf of Laurentian University, it gives me great pleasure to welcome everyone to the gathering today. But to begin, we acknowledge the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850. We also recognize that Laurentian University and Science North are located on the traditional lands of the Atikamekw, Anishinaabeg, and that the greater city of Sudbury also includes the traditional lands of the Wanapitei First Nation. Let me ask you a quick question. What color is COVID-19? This is a question that came to my mind when I was thinking about what I would say this morning to introduce the session. And I bet what you're thinking is that COVID-19 is red. We've all seen the pictures on TV news, arriving in our social media inboxes, even at brochures, in walk-in clinics or in GP surgery, the spiky red ball. But is COVID really red? Or is it just somebody's interpretation of the virus's color? I turned to a few of Laurentian's exceptionally talented scientists to see if I could find out the answer. It wasn't conclusive, but it appears that at 50 billionths of a meter across, the virus is so small that it would not even interact with the wavelengths of light that correspond to the colors. In other words, it would be transparent, not red at all. And I think what this illustrates is that in this age of social media, information customized to individual Facebook profiles, the shenanigans of Cambridge Analytica or deepfake videos, we can need help to understand scientific communications that bombard our social media inboxes. And this is all the more true for people who are locked down because they might be on their own. And how are they going to know what information to trust? But help is at hand. We've got these wonderful Let's Talk COVID-19 events, and we have experts in science communications on hand too. Both Amy and Samantha are graduates of Laurentian University's Science Communications program. It is a program that is delivered in partnership with Science North, which is Canada's second largest science centre, and it provides their students with experiential learning opportunities for research and the application of science communication principles. The master's program delivers a multidisciplinary experience that covers the theory of underlying good communication as well as the practical challenges of effectively communicating science and the issues of science in society. This is clearly just what we need. So I'm going to hand things back over to Amy now, one of these expert science communicators, and Amy's going to guide us through the next hour. Over to you, Amy.
Thank you, Dean. That was a great introduction. And yes, I am a graduate of Laurentian University's Science Communication program. And since we began that program in 2005, we have seen information and how we communicate science change dramatically. And that has changed how we've studied science communication. And I think that is a great introduction of introducing our panel today. They are all researchers within the field of science communication. And so I'm going to introduce them to you one at a time. I'm going to start with Sam because she is a fellow graduate of the program with me. Samantha Fowler is a graduate of the Science Communication Graduate Program. Sam is going to share a little bit about her research today and recent research. We have Dr. Chantal Berriot. She is the director of the Science Communication Program at Laurentian University as well, so she'll be coming on. And we have Dr. Timothy Caulfield. Now, Dr. Caulfield is a really special guest with us. He is a Canada Research Chair in Health, Law, and Policy out of the University of Alberta. He's also, you may notice him, you may look at his face and go, hey, wait a minute, I kind of recognize that guy. He's also a best-selling author and a host producer of the television documentary series A User's Guide of Cheating Death, which is on Netflix. So if you've been wanting to binge watch some stuff, especially when we're in lockdown, what a great thing to take a look at on Netflix. So welcome, everyone. I'm really excited. And we're missing Chantal. There she is. Excellent. I was like, where did she go? There she is. Welcome, everyone. I think this is probably the most exciting panel that we've had yet. And it's not just because it sits in my wheelhouse of research. So I think that's probably where I'm mostly excited by. But I think today, when we listen to the news today, we have just been bombarded with information where Ontario is in another lockdown scenario that was announced yesterday, starts tomorrow. And people are getting this information in all kinds of different ways. And I know when I've been on, I don't know, my social media as an example, I have seen friends of mine share things and I've questioned them. And I'm like, what is that? And I'm sure every single one of us has done the same thing where we've taken a look at something, right? And we've looked at it and said, that just doesn't seem right to me. So Timothy, I'm going to start with you, right? There are some really absurd claims that are out there about COVID-19. And maybe you can tell us some of those really absurd claims and give us some examples of that, because I think people need to know where are we coming from with this mis and disinformation.
Well, first of all, thank you for involving me in this great panel. You are right. There is so much misinformation out there. There's misinformation about the source of the pandemic. So we're talking the 5G conspiracy theory, this idea, which doesn't even make, by the way, scientific sense. It's not scientifically plausible. This is the idea that 5G technology caused the pandemic. This the idea that it's a bioweapon. And by the way, a large sector of Canadian society believes, and I think we have to be careful, describing what I mean by believe, but believes that, if you that conspiracy theory. And of course, there's conspiracy theories also about how we're supposed to treat COVID. I'm sure people have heard about the cow urine one. Have you guys heard that one? It's the idea if you drink cow urine, it'll cure. And by the way, this one's getting a resurgence, so to speak.
Oh
there's also been more complex ones like the hydroxychloroquine debacle. That's a very good example of misinformation because it kind of emanates more from a sort of traditional source of scientific information. And now that we're moving into the era of vaccines and genuine strategies, we're seeing misinformation about everything around masks. The idea that masks harm you. No, they don't, by the way. There's no evidence to back that up. And there's also misinformation, of course, about the vaccine. So let me just give you a couple stats here. In the United States, 28%, see that, 28%. 28% of Americans believe the Bill Gates conspiracy theory about the vaccine, which is a hardcore conspiracy theory. This is the idea that Bill Gates started the pandemic to force vaccination so he could put microchips in all of us, despite the fact that we're all carrying around a supercomputer in our pockets, and that's probably good enough to achieve his evil ends. But this is the mere fact that 28% of the population are willing to believe that. Now, again, we have to be careful about how deeply they actually hold these views, but they're out there. And the last thing I think I want to highlight before I move on is we have seen some really depressing numbers about the number of Canadians believing misinformation about the vaccine. So confidence in the vaccine way back in February started really, really high. It started to deteriorate. And in fact, a study in Alberta found that only 48%, this came out just a couple of days ago, only 48% of Albertans would get the vaccine right away. And now we're starting to see a little bit of an uptick, and I'm sure people have seen that in the news. I think that's because of efficacy, people understanding how important the vaccine is, but also because what we're talking about today, good science communication is having an impact. I don't have science to back that up, but I know it's true. So yeah, misinformation about everything from the start, the cures, and now we're getting misinformation about policies and strategies to fight it. I could go on, Amy, but there's a good sampling of what we're dealing with.
Absolutely. Now, what are the stats like for Canada, as an example? Do we know what percentage of people in Canada believe that COVID-19 is a hoax or something, as an example? Like, do we have any of those stats within Canada?
We do. There's been a lot of research on it. One of my favorites was done at Carleton University by some colleagues of mine, Josh Greenberg being just one of them. And they found about, believe it or not, 46% of Canadians believe at least one of the big conspiracy theories. So again, things like the hydroxychloroquine thing or the bioweapon story. Now, what's interesting is if you break down those numbers, and this is very relevant to what you said in the intro, Amy, you find that about let's use the hydroxychloroquine story. I think it's 23% of Canadians believe that, but it goes up to 30% for the younger demographic. Now, these researchers speculate, it's not that demographic, is dumber. That demographic has less critical thinking. They speculate they're just exposed to it more, right? They see social media more, and their lives are more frenetic, right? So this is the 18 to 30 demographic, and I think if we went younger, we'd find the same thing. So that really just speaks to the power, I think, of social media and the need to empower virtually everyone to be able to tease out what's real and what's not real. So the numbers are pretty grim in Canada too.
And I think that would surprise some people, honestly. Like, I think sometimes, being a part of a different country, we do get a lot of, American news as an example, right? And we do see a lot of it. And I think we're hypercritical of other people, but we often forget that happens within our own country, with our own media that we see every day. And that's a really important thing to take note of, for sure. Now, I think misinformation is just a really interesting word. And I think just to give us kind of a standing point, Tim, do you want to just talk to us a little bit about what do we mean by misinformation, disinformation, fake news, all of these different terms that we kind of hear about, and what are we working with today?
So misinformation, well, let's start with disinformation. Okay, sure. Disinformation is a term that's often used to describe information that's circulating that has intent behind it. So someone has decided, I want to spread misinformation about something in particular. I have an agenda, be it a political agenda, I have some ideological agenda, I have some reason I want to spread misinformation, or even perhaps you have something you're trying to sell. So that's, there's intention behind it, Misinformation is information, perhaps there is an intent. It's your uncle is sending you something, your crazy uncle is sending you something, and or maybe even is speculating, and that just takes off. I think increasingly, I do this, and I'm curious what my colleagues think here. I am increasingly using the phrase or the term misinformation as the umbrella term to capture kind of everything, because we have fake news, we have sort of fraud, we have disinformation, and I think misinformation is captured, and increasingly the infodemic, I love this term, is also out there, and it's interesting. I read a definition of the infodemics just yesterday, trying to put a little more teeth on it, and they suggested why the phrase infodemic is good, because it also speaks to sort of the impact, right? The environment in which this information is being disseminated. Again, you touched on this, Amy, the social media space in which it's coming out, and there's so much noise, there's so much information that there's an infodemic, right? That's making it hard to tease out what's real and what's not real.
What's not real, absolutely. So I kind of want to get into this discussion a little bit about, being in this realm of receiving this information. And Sam's research that she did as part of her graduate degree, I think was Well, I read it. It was incredible because one of the things that Sam did was she looked at the environment where people are talking about certain issues with information. And so, Sam, I want you to tell a little bit about your social media research that you did, because you looked at social media environments where people may have been, as an example, and especially with COVID, right, as we're talking about dissemination of vaccines and getting our vaccines out there, about you went into the world of social media with vaccine hesitant people. And what did you find?
I definitely went deep into the world of social media. I was looking specifically at Facebook and vaccination hesitancy. I use this term vaccination hesitancy as opposed to vaccine hesitancy because it's so much bigger than just being scared of the vaccine. It's being scared of the vaccine. It's not being scared of the disease. It's thinking a disease won't affect you. It's being scared of needles. It's worrying about your civil rights and your individual liberties and whether vaccinations impede on these. Vaccination hesitancy is just such a bigger term than just looking at specifically the vaccine itself. So I looked specifically at what was being talked about and how it was being talked about on vaccination hesitant Facebook pages, specifically about the COVID-19 pandemic. And what I actually found really surprised me. I wasn't surprised that the pandemic was what most of these pages were talking about most of the time. But what did surprise me was this idea that most of the time, vaccination hesitant Facebook pages weren't talking about the COVID-19 vaccine. They were talking about misinformation about everything to do with the pandemic.
Interesting.
In fact, 80% of the time, they were talking about other topics related to the pandemic that were not vaccines, that included the government response, lockdowns, testing and tracking, masks. And it was really this environment where all of this misinformation could really spread, because what I found was these Facebook pages were kind of treated as safe spaces for people. There were a lot of what I called community building tactics within a vaccination hesitant Facebook page, where people kind of supported each other and were like, and there was a lot of comments of like, yeah, that's right. And like, good for you for posting that. There was lots of recruitment of bringing in other people and tagging people on Facebook so more people could see what was being posted and this misinformation or what they considered real information. And there was what I called a lot of community appreciation, where people actually said, I'm so happy to have this space where I can share these ideas, because when I go out in the real world, people call me crazy for saying that Bill Gates is causing the lockdown to put microchips in our brain.
Yeah.
But there was kind of this flip side to it. Yes, everyone within these pages consider these safe spaces where they could talk and share their ideas. But in actuality, these were toxic, violent, hateful spaces where there was a lot of violence, a lot of attacking, both of people within the groups, commenters, as well as public health officials. And one of the things that just struck me was this idea that it wasn't just pro-vaccine people or pro-safety protocol people and commenters that were being attacked. There was people who just practice simple critical thinking, who said, hey, I definitely agree, vaccines are evil, but this might not be the best resource to prove that. And they were attacked. Wow. There was someone else who just commented that, hey, World Health Organization in your post is spelled wrong. I definitely agree with the post. It's just spelled wrong. And they were attacked.
Right. Oh my gosh.
So
it's interesting, right? Because I can sit and listen to you talk and think to myself, I've seen that, and I've seen it, but maybe not always been as aware of it, right? On my own Facebook pages that I follow, as an example, right? And I find that I find that really, really eye-opening as an example. I just really want to break in here for a second, though, because we're gonna keep this conversation going. But I want to remind our viewers that in the comments, on whether you're watching on YouTube or whether you're watching on Facebook, you can go ahead, put comments, put questions in there. I'm going to be able to see them, which is great, and I'll bring them into the conversation. So So if you have a question, just put it in and I will make sure that our speakers get it and we can keep the conversation going. Sam, did you have anything else to add about your research?
I think the last thing I wanted to add was that a lot of people were grouping together around this idea of what I called perceived civil liberties. So they believed that they had individual rights to not wear a mask, to not get vaccinated, to not be forced to be vaccinated, to go wherever they want, whenever they wanted. And a lot of these perceived civil liberties is what people kind of were banding together, and why I think there was a lot of recruitment on these pages, because people were saying, oh yeah, I feel that too. I believe I should have these rights and that I have these fundamental rights. And oh, hey, that does apply to vaccines and that does apply to mask wearing and lockdowns. And because I believe I have these rights, I won't follow these safety protocols. And it's easier to believe this misinformation if you already have that belief.
Right. Absolutely. We just had a question come in for you, Sam. So I just want to make sure that we catch this one. And maybe any panelist at all, but it relates to what we're seeing on social media. Do you notice if there's any change in the conversation focusing on the COVID-19 vaccine in particular? So has it changed since the beginning of the pandemic? Has it morphed into anything new? We're kind of curious about this as we're putting forth the vaccine and giving people vaccines currently.
So my research was really focusing on one short time frame at the beginning of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, I didn't get to see a lot of the change. But what I did see within those 3 months was this idea that it didn't really matter what new information was coming out. People like to focus and pull articles that supported their beliefs from 4 months ago, from a year ago, because people were pulling this information from different time periods to say, but this article says this. The other thing I really saw is we came up with new information, and that sometimes changes our scientific ideas. There was a time at the pandemic where we were a little unsure how effective masks were, and then as we got the best information, scientists wanted to share that with the public. Mm-hmm. But the impact this was on the vaccination hesitant communities or Facebook pages that I was looking at was that any type of changing opinion was immediately critiqued and said, well, they know nothing then.
Right.
And you have to change your mind. You never knew anything to start with.
Right. So challenging this idea, right, of the scientific voice and the scientific ideas, right? Well, we just had another question come in, and it falls exactly into what I wanted Chantal to talk about today. So it's like the perfect segue. But I think when we're talking about these social groups, right, and whether it's an online group like Sam's been describing, or whether it's a group that is like your own social, circle, the people that you text, the people who you call, the people who you're, generally within your social bubble, people spread information in different ways, right? And Chantal, I really want you to can you bring us this idea of how this information kind of gets spread within these communities? And we had a question about, why, about our brains and how our brains work in all this. So why are people, more prone to latch on to some of these conspiracy theories, just like Sam was talking about, and really not let go of them, no matter what kind of evidence that you might put in front of them?
Oh, that's such an important question. And I think it's actually understanding how we think and how our brains process new information is actually part of our toolkit to protect ourselves against misinformation. So understanding that our brains actually like to take mental shortcuts. We are all like this. We are humans. Our human brain wants to make things easy, because you spend less mental energy diving, not having to dive deep into something and really go and find the right answer or the valid or the credible source. It's much easier for us, I don't want to say you, because we are all humans with brains that operate this way, where when it's easy, it's easier to click, it's easier to read just a headline, it's easier to latch on to something that actually conforms or fits in what you already kind of believe or think you believe. Similar again to what Samantha was saying. So if you're coming across similar misinformation regularly, right? Like Amy, you were saying, I see it on my Facebook feed sometimes, like, where does this come from?
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the way that our cognitive biases or our mental shortcuts work is if it's easy, it becomes familiar. And if it becomes familiar, it feels true. And research has shown us this, that the more familiar we are, the more, and we might not even be seeking this out. It just, we're on our Facebook feeds, we're on our Instagram feeds, we're on our Twitter feeds, and it's coming back. You know, this idea that Timothy brought up about the microchipping or the 5G networks or the what have yous. If we keep seeing that, even if we're not consciously consuming it and going, oh, we see it often, it becomes familiar. And unfortunately for our brains, familiar is easy. Familiar feels true. And the more that we realize that that's how our brains function, the more that we can actually kind of inoculate ourselves or like protect ourselves. We're talking about inoculation with vaccines. Well, consider a vaccine against misinformation to be more aware of how our brains take shortcuts.
Right.
I think that one of the more damaging things that we come across is the headlines, right? Headlines, and either they may even be coming from credible sources like news agencies, but they may very well be coming from not credible sources and people that are pushing disinformation, as Timothy was telling us a while ago. And when we're just reading a headline, those headlines become familiar. Mm-hmm. And one of the ones that I'm actually kind of a bit upset about right now is reading the big headlines that are saying there's a lot of vaccine hesitancy. There's a lot of vaccine hesitancy. Right. We keep seeing that headline. Well, guess what? That's becoming familiar now.
Right.
And so people coming across that who don't go to the second little line, you know, there's the big lead and then there's the sub headline that says, however, 78% still believe that it's effective. That little sub headline's not getting read. So what is sticking in people's minds is the big, we're all hesitant. Well, then maybe I should be hesitant. And that's why I say that being aware that we take, our brains take the easy route and we take the shortcuts and that's easy and that's familiar. We need to be aware that we're doing that. Yeah. And to not be afraid to dig deeper and actually read the article. I was actually really pleasantly surprised last week when I found that when I go to retweet an article now in Twitter, if I haven't read the article, I'm now prompted. I am now prompted, and the Twitter actually says, do you want to read the full article before you retweet this? And I was actually blown away. Yeah, I was blown away. And I'm like, what a great step in the right direction to make us stop. And I guess that's the last thing I'll say, you know, and hand it back to you, Amy. But it's this last thing I'm going to say is stop before you click. Right. Stop before you share. Pause and think. Right.
Absolutely. Now, here's a question for everybody, because I'm curious about this. Just building off of what Chantal just said, and we did have this question come in from the feed as well, is if we talk, the more that we talk about this, the more that we talk about the specific examples that Chantal and Sam and Tim have given us, you know, do we give that piece of misinformation power by doing that? Or how do we take that power away?
I can comment on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Tim. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's called the Backfire Effect. And it's fascinating. And Chantal knows this probably better than I do. There's a really interesting research on this. And a lot of it came from studies about 2010, where it was research done in a very specific context. And what they found is if you provide, you know, misinformation, that in that context, with those studies, people became more entrenched in their views and they became more likely to believe it. Well, almost all of the research since 2010 has either not found a backfire effect or found it to be very rare. I've called it the backfire myth, and that's probably an overstatement because I think it does happen and we need more research on it. But the message is it should not scare people away from debunking, because debunking works. Debunking works. And that's a really important message. And what's interesting is the backfire effect has become so entrenched that you see people in the media believe it. Well, I shouldn't debunk this because it's just going to give it power. But that's not the case. In fact, there has been some research that has even shown that you can repeat something when you're debunking it as long as you do it well, right? As long as you do it well, and as long as you make the memorable part of your message the correct stuff, right? So, they talk about the truth sandwich, and there's a little bit of evidence, and not 100% it has to be a sandwich, but I think saying make the truth the memorable part of it, it's okay to repeat it. And then in fact, I think you can take absurd things like the Bill Gates thing as cultural moments to talk about the science, to talk about the good stuff, right? And use pop culture moments to get out the good science. And I think we can all do that, whether you're a student, or whether you're a researcher. Don't be afraid to get out there and debunk, because yes, debunking works. It really does. And we can talk about what good debunking looks like maybe a little bit later.
Yeah,
Right?
if I could add to that, Timothy, exactly what you were saying, debunking works. And in fact, not taking the opportunity to correct misinformation does more harm than good.
Yeah.
So, because you're leaving it out there, you're letting it, and I'm talking about, on social media channels in particular, it's okay to call it out. And you were saying you're giving it legs, or the whole myth behind the backfire effect. No, but we shouldn't do is just say that's wrong. Because what you do when you just say that's wrong is now you're leaving an actual gap in people's brains. And you're not replacing it with something. And I'm going to go back to how our brains work. Our brains are very uncomfortable with having a gap. It's like, I need to fill that gap. And if I don't fill that gap, that misinformation is just going to stay there.
Right.
So research shows that our role as communicators, or even as trusted family members, nerd nodes of trust, to borrow a phrase from one of my favorite science communicators, Liz Neely, as nerd nodes of trust, it's understanding, listening to that misconception, to that misinformation, but knowing how to replace it. Oh, I know where that comes from. I've heard this one. I've also come across it. I can see why you believe this. Let me tell you what the explanation is, where this came from in the first place, and what's actually true. That's the way to it's the way to people's brains. We say, what's the way to people's hearts? Well, this is the way to people's brains, is don't leave them hanging with an empty spot in their head that they feel uncomfortable with.
Yeah. And
sorry, go ahead, Sam.
Just really quickly, one of the other things I was really hearing when you were talking, Chantel, was this importance of empathy, of not just attacking the person and saying you're wrong and walking away. Because then as the person who's being corrected, you just feel attacked. One of the language I usually use is don't call them out, call them in. So don't call them out and say, oh, you're an idiot, that's horrible, and then walk away. Call them into a conversation and really base it in empathy of that, that's a common misbelief. Let's talk about why that's wrong.
Yeah, we just had a comment come in as an example where this person, they really tried to debunk somebody who was, an anti-vaxxer, as an example, right? And that person just kept coming back over and over and over, probably with the same arguments, and they just, they're not going to break down, right? And I can feel as somebody, which you're like, no, I have this right information. I really need you to listen to me, right? Like what kind of, and eventually this person kind of just gave up, right? Which is, understandable, because it's exhausting to do that kind of, over and over and over again, where someone's not backing down. Is there any way to convince somebody who is like that? Like, is there any way to fill a different gap in their brain?
No.
That's a great answer.
No. So again, I think that this individual should keep trying, and I totally agree with Samantha. Be nice, be empathetic, use narratives, do what you can to play, get a sense of what their values are in order to speak to them in their community, to try to understand their community and what their concerns are. But if someone is a hardcore denier, you're not changing their mind. It's very, very difficult. And part of that is, Samantha, I think, is tied to the ideological component. We can come back to that, because I think that's a really interesting part of the equation. But rule number one from the World Health Organization is always remember that the general public is your audience, not that hardcore denier, because it takes so much psychological energy, so much effort to try to change their mind. And I think when you're talking about the general public, I think that might be your family. So this individual might use the opportunity of talking to this person to getting across the good science to people in their community. That's rule number one. Rule number two, you can use good science. Use the good science, and then Phil, as Chantel says, talk about the logic gaps that are being used to push the misinformation. Those are two of the strategies that can be used. There have been really interesting studies that have been done on with the people who are vaccination hesitant to get a sense of, is there an intervention that can work? And one that that moved the dial a little bit was if you use a variety of methods. So what they did is they had one group they just gave the facts to, and another group they gave the facts. They provided a story from the perspective of a parent trying to make a decision about vaccination, right? So that plays to their values, their concerns, right? And they showed the parent pictures of what the disease actually looks like. Here's the consequences of the disease. So you're using a visual image, you're using a narrative, which we know humans are sort of wired to respond to, and you're using good, reliable facts. And that did have an impact. It was interesting because it changed intention to vaccinate, even if it didn't change the underlying belief system, right? So they go, I'm still really skeptical, but given the information you've given me, I'm going to vaccinate my kids, right? So sometimes the behavior leads the the intention with something like this. But yeah, bottom line, don't invest. I get so much hate mail. I get when we get off here, there'll be so much hate mail in my inbox or in my Twitter feed. It's just not worth your energy. Focus that message, that positive message, on the general public or just the people in your family and your community.
Right. So if we look at somebody, though, that may be a friend or a family member of ours that we know maybe isn't, of that, deep entrenched kind of ideology, right? But they've shared a piece of misinformation, and that it's like, I'm not really quite sure about this, right? How especially when it's somebody that's close to you, right? And you kind of like, I kind of feel bad. We're very polite Canadians, so it's, I kind of feel bad about, pointing out that maybe you're wrong. Like, how would you approach somebody who's like a really good friend of yours when they've shared a piece of misinformation?
I can actually respond to that because I've done it twice, and and it's in family circles and on Facebook, which means then it's public, right? Mm-hmm. And it's hard, and I totally agree, and I'm seeing the question too from the audience that they're asking the same thing. It's like, how do you do this? Mm-hmm. And it's hard, and I have to be really honest here and tell you that when I was writing up my kind of reply, my heart was racing, and I had like that sick feeling in the pit of my stomach. But what I did do is not do it publicly, right? Because we know that you can take people, especially if you're friends with them on Facebook, you can send them a message in Messenger, right? Or you can maybe have an actual conversation. Heaven forbid we pick up a phone and do the old-fashioned landline, but we can have an actual conversation. And we're afraid because we think they're going to push back really hard. And I'm going to go to Tim. What Tim was saying, what the WHO says, is that most people are not hardline resistors or what have you. They're actually, So I had this happen in my family with my family member who shared something that was very wrong about the potential, harms of vaccinations. And I went deep into that that post, found the source, showed them the source, went on Snopes website, which like debunks everything. And you can find these sites. Snopes is one of them, SNOPES, where they basically tackle every bit of misinformation that's ever been put out in the world, and they find the source for it. And I shared that with them. And they said, wow, okay, thank you so much. Without me asking, they went and removed their post and said, thanks to my friend or my cousin or whatever who did this, this is actually not true. So it's possible. You can do it. Right. Be empathetic, listen, and replace the gap with the right information.
Right. We just had a comment come in, and it's right on topic where, Tim was mentioning, like, it's really hard, right, to convince somebody who is of a very, very strict, ideological mindset. And so in our role as science communicators, and what we should be doing is all people who want to spread really good information should, when we're talking about COVID and the COVID vaccine, instead of focusing on this group, is it better for us to focus on people who are vaccination hesitant, as Sam described, because they're a little bit more moderate and perhaps a little bit more able to grab onto the information, that the real science information that's out there? Is that a way that we can, kind of go about this on an everyday?
Yes, I think so. And I think that that most science communicators and public health authorities would agree that, it's really the vaccination hesitant that we should be focusing on, because thankfully, despite, the headlines that Chantel talked about, those hardcore deniers are still a relatively small group of Canadians. It's most of it's people just trying to make the right decision. They're just trying to figure out, there's cut through this chaotic information environment. So yeah, I think that's true. Having said that, it's still really important to tackle those crazy conspiracy theories. I remember there's a really interesting study that came out on the 5G conspiracy theory, and people ignored it. This is crazy. No one's going to believe this, but it takes on a life of its own. And so this study found that it's really important to tackle those conspiracy theories, those bits of misinformation very early with good information in order to stop it. And you've seen that happen in a couple of occasions. Do you remember here's a homegrown Canadian conspiracy theory that the federal government was creating internment camps, concentration camps for people who had COVID? The Public Health Authority got on that, I think that day. They got on social media, they got on Facebook, they got on Instagram, and they said, this is not true. And they did exactly what Chantel said. This is where it came from. This is the truth. This isn't happening. And it went away. So you can do this effectively. And I think we also need to do it, Samantha, this goes to your research. We need to do this before it takes on an ideological valence, right? Before it becomes an ideological flag. Because once it becomes an ideological flag, wearing masks, this anti-vax position, it becomes more difficult to change someone's mind. It becomes part of their personal identity, right? And then all those other cognitive biases that Chantel was talking about, and you become part of a community, as Samantha was suggesting, it becomes more difficult to change those people's minds, right? And when they're part of a community, they're going to see people like them, and we know that people like them are as credible as an expert, and they're going to have all of these sources of information that are going to feed their confirmation bias. So yes, focus on the hesitant, but we still need to debunk those crazy messages. I shouldn't say crazy, those extreme messages that are emanating from the hardcore conspiracy theorists. Sorry, I went on too long about that.
No, that's fine.
Could I just add to that? Because we often talk about ideology, like ideological thinking, and I know we have a really large high school student audience today, and I have two sons who are of high school age, and they ask me often, it's like, what does it mean? What does it mean to be ideological? And it's I'm all about demystifying big concepts and big terms, and Tim was appealing, or was referring to that and saying it's about your identity. It's like, has this become part of you so much that you feel that it's part of your identity, and that if something threatens that, like if you have this identity of being an anti-masker and being absolutely like it's my civil liberties, if this is part of your identity, then it's really hard for you to let that go. Because I'm actually, like, if I'm trying to debunk that from you, I'm attacking your identity. Think about that. Yeah. And research has actually shown that when you put people in, let's say you put people in, sorry, I'm blanking to look at your brain waves, and fMRI, thank you. And you look at people's brainwaves and you say something to them that attacks their identity, the same parts of your brain that are activated for your fight and flight response, like you literally react like you're being attacked by a bear in the forest. That is what your brain is doing. So again, though, telling people that this is how our brains work helps us, right? Yeah. Like talking to people about this is what your brain is doing to you when I tell you that, being really, really hardcore anti-masking is attached to your identity. This is what's happening in your brain. You feel like a bear is attacking you. So yeah, I wanted to just put that ideological component in there, Amy. Absolutely.
No, 100%. And when we talk about this ideological component, Sam, maybe you just want to comment on this for a little bit, because I thought it was really interesting where one of the things you pointed out was, just to reiterate again, is that if I believe one thing and I'm in a community, I'm more likely to believe something else is connected to a similar ideology. Is that correct?
That is correct. And there've been a lot of really interesting studies to highlight that. And again, we always have to be careful, and Samantha and Chantel can back me up on this, because it's hard to study this well, right? It's hard to get really robust data. So often you get this data that's sort of suggestive of a trend. But that's absolutely the case where these ideas cluster together with groups, especially when the ideas become part, sort of a representative, a flag of that community. There was some really interesting research, again, a qualitative study, but I think the research is really interesting about alternative medicine. So people may seek out alternative medicine for completely understandable reasons. They're looking for something that's efficacious. They have had a bad experience with conventional medicine. Then, so they're almost like these evidence-based, experienced reasons why they're seeking out alternative medicine. But then once they become part of that community, they take on the sort of the philosophical position of the community, and their reasons for being there shift. And I think that happens with anti-vax things too. People may have sort of legitimate concerns or questions about vaccines. They become attracted to the kind of websites that Samantha was talking about. They become part of that community, and all of a sudden it becomes about personal identity, philosophy, ideology, and it becomes more difficult to shift their position. And again, I think there's pretty good research to back up all of that story.
Right. And Sam, is that what you found in your research? Like, is that because you lived in these communities for like 3 months, right?
Yeah, it was definitely, and that was one of the ideas that once you were kind of in this community, even though you came here for anti-vaccination beliefs, suddenly people were talking about masks and why masks didn't work and why the lockdown is hurting people more than it's helping people and all of these things. And because they kind of had these same kind of root causes where I too am worried about my perceived civil liberties, I'm scared for my individual rights. Oh, this other argument kind of makes sense too, because this is also an individual rights argument. And then it goes back to that support where people were very supportive. And if you kind of came in kind of questioning like, hey, I'm a little unsure about, I think masks might not be working, people were quick to be like, no, they're not working. You are 100% correct. And they kind of built each other up. And then whenever you had dissenting ideas, they attacked you and tore you down. So once you were in these communities, it really affected you because it created these echo chambers where you could really only voice certain beliefs and certain thoughts.
Right. I want to reverse that thought idea for a second. And I want to think about me as I'm going to make about me here, but about me as an example. I'm a scientist, right? I live in a world where every day of the week I talk about science. That is, that's what we do at the Science Center, right? And I surround myself with people who also are scientists, who also read scientific papers, right? And that is a really, really important, part of my identity, right? And when somebody, as an example, attacks, scientists, I get really like uptight about it, right? And so if you can kind of think about how, attacking identities might hurt the other person or make that other person feel, does that help us communicate better? Because I'm thinking that would be a good connection to sort of think about yourself so that you can kind of reverse it and help somebody else.
I think empathy is so important when doing science communication, to actually put yourself in their shoes and try to understand, because it both helps you develop an argument. If you understand how they got to a certain point where they believed something, then that can help you develop that argument and hit that, oh, hey, this is the source that we should be talking about. Hey, this is the logical fallacy that we can point out. But it also helps you just come at it in a more opening, honest conversation where people are more willing to actually talk to you.
Right, exactly. Now we've been talking about vaccine hesitancy as as people who are looking at information that's out there that may not be correct, trying to balance decisions for themselves, decisions for their families about safety and societal connections and things like that. But there's a really important kind of issue that's out there when we talk about vaccine hesitancy. And one of our viewers brought this up, and I really want to make sure that we get to it. There is legitimate concerns who are out there about vaccine hesitation, right? And whether it's because of your own health status, as an example, or whether it's this sort of break in trust between doctors, between medical professionals, because there have been people who have faced and they continue to face discrimination within our healthcare system over and over and over again. They've experienced actual harm historically from the medical community, and there is a really huge legitimate sense of distrust there. And so how can we build this trust better so that they can also, understand the importance of this, but also feel like they're in a safe environment and feel safe that way as well?
I can start with that one if you want, and Sam and Tim, please jump in if you want to add. I've been doing a lot of reading about this as well, and definitely there's communities that have legitimate and very well-deserved mistrust of medical communities or medical professionals because they've either been harmed by them or marginalized by them. People of color, indigenous populations, they might very well legitimately hesitate to trust the medical community. And many of the research papers that I've been reading, or even opinion papers that I've been reading, have been suggesting that we have to build trust with people in their own community, and they have to have leadership in their community speak on that, and help do that communication. It's not going to do much good for Tim or me or Samantha to go into one of those communities because we are not BIPOC, or we're not, from communities of color or indigenous communities. But we can have those conversations with people that they trust in their own communities to do that communication and to do that engagement and listening, right?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that this is a very important issue, and one that I think that increasingly science communicators are recognizing. There was a great piece in the New Yorker, I think it came out just a couple of days ago, about the Black community in the United States. And we know the numbers down there with respect to vaccination hesitancy. They're much higher among people of color, particularly the Black communities. And there are obvious reasons for that. There are obvious reasons for distrust between that community, and not just the government, but also the health authorities and researchers, right? There's a historical reasons why that distrust isn't there. I actually hope that one of the legacies of the pandemic is a greater appreciation of the role of trust in this context, and the incredible importance of maintaining trust and getting to the roots of trust and trying to make systemic changes, right? Systemic changes that are going to ensure that trust is earned and maintained.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So we just had another comment come in about, Canadians as a whole, right? And Canadians making their own personal decisions about vaccines. And one of the things that they're saying is that maybe people don't have enough information that's out there. And we had another question earlier about just, we feel that maybe scientists are not doing their jobs of communicating about the vaccine and the safety of it and the safety protocols that go into it. And where can we do better so that people can make those informed choices? Where can we do better as medical professionals, as scientists, as science communicators?
Well, I can speak to that really quickly, because I want to have one sort of counter to that. Because I actually think that there is a lot of good information out there. In fact, the information that it can be pretty straightforward, right? About risk, about the history of the research, about the regulatory process, debunking those kind of myths about, impact on your DNA, and no, it's not going to make you infertile. And, I think that information is out there, but I think that the idea that there isn't enough information out there, that there are these lingering questions, unfortunately, I think that is partly because of how effective the anti-vax community has been. They have injected doubt and uncertainty. People don't have these questions about, they go to get Botox. They go to their corner store and they take a bunch of supplements that are 40% chance they're contaminated, right? And they don't go, I don't feel like I've got enough information about this. But the anti-vax community has done a very good job of creating doubt, of creating uncertainty, of creating the idea that we need more and more information. Now, having said that, that was kind of almost a glib. I do think if people have these concerns, we do need to listen, and we do need to give them the information that they need and they want, and importantly, in a form that is digestible. And importantly, we have to meet them where they are. So that means TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and we have to do all of that. And this is going to be a plug for this. I'm actually doing this a little early. We have something that's called Science Up First that launches on Monday. I think it's Monday.
Yeah.
And we are involving the Canadian Association of Science Centers in this initiative. And this is hopefully a initiative that's social media based. Hashtag Science Up First. Students, please become involved in this. That is aimed at getting this information out to everyone in a form that is digestible, content that is digestible and shareable. That was more than you wanted, but it was an important question.
That's an important question. For sure. We're gonna wrap things up, but I do want to just ask one more question to each of you, and you can answer it however you want, because Tim, you gave a great idea there. I love, Chantal, the nerd note of trust. I know I'm the nerd note of trust. Yeah, absolutely. But also this idea of being an advocate for science, right? So how can, what are something that each of you would suggest of how we can be better advocates for science within our families, our community, and within our friend groups?
I can start with that. I use the word nerd note of trust, and I'm not taking credit for that term. Liz Neely, a shout out to her if you want to look her up on Twitter. But my advice is this idea of up science first, or science up first, go science, and become that person in your family group or in your friends group that helps people check things out. Mm-hmm. You're trusted, they're your friends, they're your family. It's like, oh, maybe Chantal can help me answer that. Maybe Sam can help me answer that. Become that person, that empathetic, understanding listener in your friend and family group that people will go to.
Absolutely.
I think for me, it's all about sharing good content, because one of the things is vaccination hesitant communities, they're always there. They're always sharing content. But we, as people who believe vaccines work, really only share content at specific times. So just be there, share the good science as much as you can and as creatively as you can. Tim mentioned TikTok. I'm on TikTok right now trying to explore and figure out what it is. And there's some amazing content on there for science communication, answering questions about why vaccines work, why we should be wearing masks, why we should be social distancing, and targeting people where they are.
Excellent.
I'll end with saying, it's been raised already. I think, Samantha, you talked about this. Research says that we can just nudge people to pause and sort of embrace a culture of accuracy, we can make a real difference. It's a simple intervention, but if you can just get people to pause and think before they share. So, check first, share after. I would encourage that. And then, yes, what Samantha just said, let's get the good content out there, and everyone can join Science Up First on Monday. Become part of the Go Science team. Let's make this a social movement. So thanks very much. And yeah, go science.
Oh, I didn't even notice that banner behind you. That is fantastic. Science Up First. That's going to be officially announced on Monday, I think you said, but we got a sneak peek of it, so don't tell anybody. But I think it's most importantly to tell everybody, and that's the biggest message of the day. I want to thank each of you, our panelists today. Thank you so much for taking the time. This was an important conversation as we hear across the various news and media feeds that we see every day. This is the topic that everybody is talking about, and I'm so glad that we got to share in this of talking about this today. So, and I want to thank our audience as well, because this is the end of our series about COVID-19 for now. We never know when we might just bring this back and start up again, but this was our season, and we have talked all kinds of things. If you missed any of the episodes of our previous episodes that we had before the new year, you can always go back on both Science North's Facebook and YouTube, and also Laurentian University's Facebook page, and go back and take a look at the old episodes, get involved in the conversation, and most importantly, make sure that you're spreading the right and good information. So thank you very much, everybody, and thank you to everyone, and we will see you soon.